A little chilly in here today.
Yeah, well, our boilers are not working, so...
Oh, to get those fixed before the winter.
Yeah, we're just trying to get some good quotes, because last time we didn't get a decent supply.
Oh, sorry. Testing, testing.
This is better. You were closer to us.
Yeah, this feels better. I felt like I was miles away.
I'll send an email.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and start then? If there's a few more people wandering in, that'll be fine. Let's just take a moment to refresh our motivation. We won't do a full meditation as we did this morning. We can think about what we've already discussed today. This idea that we have to overcome these two states of mind that are in opposition to our becoming enlightened. The first, this mind that tends to focus on ourselves. Might even just recollect throughout this day, even throughout the lunch break, how often that mind arises, how much we get focused on what we need, perhaps don't pay as much attention to the needs of others. But then also this grasping at a self, thinking that there's a person that is real here, a person that exists independently, substantially, intrinsically, and how this is all fiction. We are engaging in so many actions on the basis of that wrong idea. So again, bodhicitta is the way to resolve these two opposing forces, to have the mind that is intent upon benefiting others and the mind that also wants to realize the deepest level of truth, the ultimate truth, the nature of reality. And just think that you're here with that motivation of wanting to increase your own understanding of this topic of mind training as a technique to combat these two opposing forces of self-cherishing, self-grasping, and in that way achieve bodhicitta, achieve ultimate bodhicitta through realizing emptiness, and eventually become enlightened, and in that state be able to benefit countless sentient beings. Okay. So we are about ready to start the text in a formal way with the homage. So again, this is the... Does everyone have the outline now? Did we get copies made of the outline? Okay. So actually, let's go ahead and look at the outline real quick, and I'll tell you the things that are a little different than... As I said, the first part, they kind of kept the verses that Thupten Jinpa had in his version, and then they changed them for later on. So the very first line, it says 1 through 7 right now. Bodhisattvas transform afflictions and self-grasping into the path. This should actually be 1 through 8, because again, Thupten Jinpa put verses 4 and 5 into a single verse. So that's why he had only 7 verses, whereas we have 8. Then verse 9 will be the next one instead of 8. In Thupten Jinpa's version, that is verse 8, but it's our verse 9. Practicing removing other suffering and giving them happiness, this practice of Tonglen. And then the next one will actually, the first part will change. Instead of 9, it'll be 10. But the 48 stays the same. Again, the rest of the numbers going down are in line with our version versus Thupten Jinpa's. Like Thupten Jinpa's had 9 through 47 instead of 10 through 48, and then had, so on. But everything else is fine on here. So again, this is a more detailed outline to what I have on the screen here. That's just the kind of main categories, the homage, conventional bodhicitta, ultimate bodhicitta, and then the final dedication verse.
Is there a difference in the colors as well? That seems a bit more light.
I know, I think they made it in color when they did this for the masters, for the basic program at Isatutta Lama Tsongkhapa, but the colors don't really mean anything. Yeah. I'm sorry that one was done in yellow, the 50 through 90. If you can't read anything, let me know during the break or something, and we'll make sure that you have what's on there. But all right, so let's go to the homage. So I like to actually have people recite the text as we go through it. So each of the verses, before we go through and do the commentary, we'll say them. So let's say the homage together. To the great wrathful one, Yamantaka, I pay homage. So Yamantaka or Yamantaka, it's pronounced differently by different practitioners, but this is actually a tantric deity in highest yoga tantra, which is the fourth class of tantra. The one that is said essential to practice to attain full enlightenment in the tantric path. So this already alludes to some of the tantric elements of this text, that there will be some places where Dharma Rakshita gives reference to tantra. So just know that will be happening. The word Yamantaka, of course, the being himself, who is this embodied being with so many faces and horns and arms and all of this. The definitive meaning is the exalted wisdom of non-dual bliss and emptiness. This is what we mean in Tantra, highest yoga Tantra in particular, as what these beings represent. They represent the combination of those two, which are essentially wisdom and method, brought together into that embodiment. But there's always an interpretative meaning, which is kind of what needs to be interpreted to get at that definitive meaning. So the interpretative, of course, is this view or this vision of Rathmal Yamantaka, who appears in the aspect of that very form and shape. So this is what is meant by Yamantaka is the being who we will visualize when you're doing highest yoga tantra, for example. You do your deity yoga, you would visualize yourself arising in the form of that particular being. The word Yamantaka, Yama usually refers to death. There's the Lord of Death, which is called Yama, which isn't some being like the Grim Reaper that exists somewhere. This is just an embodiment of the aspect of death, that we all have to deal with that suffering of death. And so Yamantaka is the destroyer of death, the one who completely destroys death. So it's interesting because there's this homage that's right at the beginning to Yamantaka, he who brings an end to death. Kind of again sets the tone for this type of imagery. Yamantaka is known as one of the wrathful deities. In Tantra, you can practice deities that have a more peaceful aspect, and many of them have a more wrathful aspect. By wrath, we mean compassion that is intent upon using forceful energy to overcome whatever the foe might be. So, as I said, there's a lot of this kind of warrior imagery and things in this text. So Yamantaka is kind of in line with that, holding various implements that are weapons and what have you. So there's definitely that component. Yamantaka is said to be the wrathful view of Manjushri. Many of you know Manjushri. Jamyang is Manjushri in Tibetan. So Manjushri, of course, is a Buddha in the form of holding a flaming sword over his head, and his other hand holds a lotus that has texts on it. The sword of wisdom, once more a bit of that imagery of cutting through, removing the obstacles, particularly our self-grasping. I don't know that I need to say a whole lot more about this, but it is kind of interesting, as I said, that you have a tantric homage right at the beginning of this text, which is essentially a sutra text, but there will be places where Dharma Rakshita makes reference to Tantra. So let's go on to the next slide. And the next one will be the outline that we're going back to. Again, looking at conventional bodhicitta in particular, this idea that bodhisattvas transform afflictions and self-grasping into the path. So the next one has that, and again with the little yellow one highlighted there where you need to make the change on that outline if you haven't. Go on to the verse. Let's read this verse together. Just as when peacocks wander in jungles of lethal poison, although there are extremely beautiful medicinal gardens, the flocks of peacocks do not delight in them, but instead are nourished by the essence of the lethal poison. So this is actually referring to what is a bit of mythology. I don't know if there's real truth to this or not. But of course, peacocks, I don't think were very populous in Tibet, but they were very populous in India. And Dharmarakshita was from India, so he used this analogy to demonstrate how there's a desire on the part of bodhisattvas to transform what would normally be poison into a path of awakening. So the story goes that peacocks go after this particular substance that's called aconite or monk's hood, wolf's bane. It's got different names, but it's there'll be a slide with a picture of it. But it essentially is something that other animals could eat, and it would actually kill them. But the peacocks, it said, actually go for that, eat that, because it makes their feathers more lustrous, makes them more beautiful. So there's different elements to this analogy then that's being used. We can go to the next slide. I think I've got them here. Oh, let's go ahead and read this first, and then I think I have the explanation of the slides of the various components of this. Let me pull it up on my tablet so I can keep track of it as well from here. Let's just read it. Similarly, when the heroes enter the jungle of cyclic existence, although there are beautiful gardens of splendid happiness, the heroes do not become attached to them, for these brave-minded ones thrive in the jungle of suffering. So this is kind of applying the analogy to the meaning. So we can go to the next verse or next slide. Of course, the peacocks are being compared to the bodhisattvas. So bodhisattvas are peacocks in this analogy. The next slide. The jungle is, of course, cyclic existence. This is, again, not meant to be so much about a physical place. When we use the term cyclic existence, sure, there is the physical world that is a manifestation of our karma, that is a part of our experience. But we're mostly talking about being in a state where we are conditioned by our karma and our delusions to experience these various things. But this is where the peacocks go wandering, is into cyclic existence. And then the poison that they ate, this is a picture of wolf's bane. It almost looks like an iris or something, but it's got this, it's sort of like a hooded flower that kind of comes down. And again, aconite or wolf's bane, it's sometimes called. And of course, the poison is the suffering that we all experience, as well as certainly the afflictions that afflict our minds, cause our mental suffering as well. So the analogy then is being made that bodhisattvas do this, that they actually, utilize what would normally be poisonous or dangerous for other beings into an opportunity to deepen their compassion, to actually make themselves more beautiful, like the peacocks, having more lustrous feathers. So the question then would be raised, well, how do they do that? How do they use afflictions in the path? In the tantric teachings, of course, there's a strong reliance upon the energy of the afflictions, if you will. I can't go into a whole explanation of Tantra and what's all involved, but many of you are familiar with the essence of Tantra, which is we still are out to overcome the afflictions. Tantra is not something where we encourage the afflictions by any means. But because we have afflictions, there is an energy that comes with the afflictions. The kind of force or charge that we have that causes us to go after objects of attachment, or even that can be there when we are confronting objects that would anger us. So in Tantra, there certainly is the concept that those particular bodhisattvas, because Tantra is only taught in the Mahayana tradition, those bodhisattvas would use the arising of the afflictions themselves, the energy that's behind them, as a very powerful element to overcome the afflictions. And this is the whole essence of what Tantra is all about, is using the afflictions in that way. Not that we cultivate the actual affliction, but we are able to isolate the energy of that affliction and channel that into this, what was mentioned earlier as the definitive meaning of Yamantaka, the union of non-dual bliss and voidness, bringing that blissful component there together with this wisdom realizing emptiness, forming that union in our minds. So there certainly is a understanding in Tantra, that an understanding that we're going to use the afflictions in this way. So the question might be, well, how do they use afflictions in Sutra? And this is where it gets maybe a little bit harder to be that definitive about it. certainly, bodhisattvas are out to be around any particular situation and use it as a learning opportunity, using it as an opportunity to develop compassion for the other beings that are involved. The situation you were describing earlier, Amelia, being where people are disagreeing with you or whatever, to see that when you're around the afflictions in this jungle of psychic existence, that they can be an impetus for us to practice deeper compassion. Now, would we actually cultivate desire or anger in a sutra tradition to be an actual path? Well, that may not be that possible. But they do say that there are some bodhisattvas, and of course, Buddhism too comes from a patriarchy. We have to understand that. So the examples frequently are men. So we have this idea of a bodhisattva who is born as a king, who sires a lot of sons, so that he can have all these bodhisattva sons to do more bodhisattva work in the world. So the desire it would take to, create and procreate, these sons that are there would be one of the ways that desire could be used in the path, but it's not really used in a more constructive way beyond that. But certainly suffering is. If we say that this poison that we call aconite here is, in essence, both suffering and the afflictions, then using suffering in the path is really the heart of the Lojong teachings, is to say that whenever we are encountering something that normally would be poison for everyone else, because as soon as something goes wrong, as soon as people get ill or they have something difficult in their lives, what happens? The afflictions arise. People get angry or upset or depressed or whatever the case might be. So what we're mostly talking about in this context in terms of how do bodhisattvas transform elements of their experience into the path, it's mostly using suffering in the path. And this is what we're going to primarily see when it comes to the examples that are coming up in this huge block of verses. It was that 10 through 48 on your outline, where we look at karmic cause and effect and all the stuff that we see that's arising from our own karma in our lives. How do we make sure that we don't create the same karma again by doing what ordinary beings would do, which is create more delusion, versus using that suffering as a way to understand the process that's involved, our own karma arising in that form, but also to identify with the suffering of others, to really use everything that we meet as an opportunity to become more courageous, more dedicated to the welfare of others, and so on. So these first two verses are kind of introducing a theme that will return later in the text. And of course, the other text that Dharma-Rakshita wrote has a whole premise for this around peacocks and poison. And it's a very powerful analogy that can be used to talk about mind training, a sort of alchemical process where we take what is base and ordinary in terms of our experience and transmute it into a path of awakening. So we can go to the next slide. I think the medicinal gardens are also mentioned. Of course, this is the pleasures of samsara, what are called here splendid perfections of samsaric happiness. Rather than being caught up in that, the bodhisattvas want to go to the difficult places. The bodhisattvas want to go back into the jungle and find the suffering, find the poison, rather than hanging out in the medicinal gardens where everything is pleasant and wonderful and nice. So that was another aspect of the analogy. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. This comes from the footnotes of this book, again, that I think it's still available out there and somewhere. It's wonderful commentary by Geshe Ngawang Dargye, but the text, just so you know, the way that they put it together, the translators, Alex and John Landau and them, they made it into a very poetic text so that they elaborated on what is actually there. What we've been reading in terms of the verses is fairly literal, whereas, it's much more elaborate in this presentation. In the footnote, there's a reference to 5 different points of similarity between bodhisattvas and peacocks. Again, this is not something horribly important, but I think it's kind of interesting. Just as the colors of the peacock's feathers grow more radiantly brilliant when they eat plants that are poisonous to other animals, bodhisattvas shine with blissful happiness by making use of such poisonous delusions as desire and attachment for the benefit of others. So again, as I said, the attachment and the desire, we could say yes, the bodhisattvas still sort of hang around in the world of all of this desire and attachment, but there's not, until you get to the tantric path, there's not as much of a use of the energy of desire in the path. Let's go to the second point of similarity. Just as peacocks have 5 crown feathers, I don't know if that's really true, could go back to the peacock slide, bodhisattvas have the attainment of the 5 paths to enlightenment, those 5 I talked about earlier. Okay? Just as the sight of the peacock's colorful display gives us great pleasure, the sight of a bodhisattva uplifts our mind because of their bodhicitta. It is quite amazing to see peacocks, when you see them with their feathers completely open. Next one. Just as peacocks live mostly on poisonous plants and never eat insects or cause harm to others, bodhisattvas never cause even the slightest harm to other sentient beings. Again, I don't know how true that is either. These are all kind of mythological. So, just as peacocks eat poisonous plants with pleasure, when bodhisattvas are offered sensory objects, although they have no attachment to them, they accept them with pleasure to allow the donor to gain merit. This is an interesting perspective, kind of the role that bodhisattvas play in participating in objects of pleasure that are offered to them and so on, because they see that there's merit gained by people offering to them. So they are happy to do that, to partake in those things. We see this with our lamas frequently, right? They'll be offered an amazing meal or a first-class seat or something, and they'd never ask for a first-class seat or for a special meal or whatever to be made for them. But they're happy to accept it because they recognize that this is a way for us sentient beings to create some merit in relation to them. Let's go on to the next. This is the first 2 lines of this next verse. Let's read this together. Because of that, those who are under the power of the cowardice that eagerly pursues happiness and pleasure spend their time in suffering. So this is being compared now, the bodhisattvas, to those who are more cowardly, who are under the control of their karma and delusions, and when they meet all these various things that bodhisattvas consider to be the poison that they want to partake, they actually do become poison for those beings. Those beings are unable to do that transmutation that the bodhisattvas are able to do. I don't know that I need to say a whole lot. As I go through this, occasionally I may draw from some of the other commentaries. Again, there was a book list that if you didn't get sent it, you'll certainly be sent it, that includes Peacock in the Poison Grove, which is the text from Geshe Lundab Zopa, his commentary on this. There's a very new commentary, maybe 2 or 3 years old now, by Venerable Thupten Chodron called Good Karma. It's really quite nice. I like what she says in her version of her commentary on it. And then there's of course this one, and I don't know that there's many other commentaries that are out there, but at least those you can look at. I haven't seen that. Okay, good. I'll maybe take a look at that. And so was that published in UK here or in Europe? Or? I'm just curious. I haven't. Or maybe that's even the one that FPMT has out with the in the basic program materials. It could be Geshe Tenzin Zopa. Let me look. That may be the one that I have here. No, I don't have that one. Okay. Yeah, I'll take a look at that. I want to share with you now a little bit from Geshe Lundab Zopa. He talks about this cowardice. He says, the cowardice that brings us suffering refers to our clinging attachment, a mental factor that seeks happiness through obtaining external possessions, relationships, praise, status, and so on. This craving prevents us from facing the unsatisfactory nature of our existence and the disadvantages of greed and attachment. Instead, we are attracted to the pleasures of cyclic existence, create more karma by pursuing them, and as a result, are repeatedly reborn. We are cowardly in the sense that we are afraid to see attachment for what it is. We fear that if we don't follow our attachment, we won't have any happiness at all. Due to our cowardice in facing the reality of the situation, we are brought to suffering. So this is this idea that you have to be somewhat courageous in confronting these afflictions, particularly attachment. I mean, as we know, attachment is sort of our default mode throughout the day. We talked about self-cherishing. It's kind of a good part of our attachment. But we are constantly looking for things to satisfy our desire for happiness, to have some fleeting experiences of pleasure. And we end up wasting a lot of our time by doing that. We spend all of our time just actually being about patterns that are creating more suffering rather than anything that creates happiness. But attachment is so tricky because it's going after the pleasurable experiences. Anger is kind of obvious to see as something we want to avoid, right? Because doesn't feel good to get angry. It's creating more turbulence in our mind. We don't feel physically good when we're angry. But when we're attached to something, we actually have this charge, this energy to it that makes us feel really good because it's about getting that pleasurable stuff. So it really does take a lot of courage, I think, from my experience. I can't say I've dealt with my attachment that effectively, but it does take a lot of courage to be able to see attachment for what it is, to see that it is actually something that can cause us to create these patterns that just exacerbate our suffering. Let's go to the next two lines and recite those. While the brave-minded ones who willingly accept suffering are always happy due to the strength of their courage. Again, we may not be there yet, but we can certainly see in many of our lamas that live with this attitude of cherishing others, of willingly accepting suffering, how delighted and happy they are. Lama Zopa Rinpoche always comes to mind whenever I study mind training because he's just somebody who is so obviously working from that place of cherishing others all the time. I remember that after he manifested the stroke in 2011, there were all these stories of him in the hospital, and all he could do was think about other people and make prayers for other beings who had been in that room before him, and he was laughing a lot. There wasn't, and any of us, we'd probably be worried to death. Oh, we got this stroke, and what is our life going to be like, and all this kind of stuff, and he had none of that. So it's obvious that there's some strength of practice that's behind that, some courage that we're able to develop. So I don't know. I mean, that's just, I think, pretty obvious when it comes to many of these beings that we see that they practice in this way. Let me see, there was another quote on courage, I thought. That's okay. Let's go on then to the next slide. Presently, attachment is like a jungle of lethal poison. It is overcome by the peacock-like heroes, but takes the life of the crow-like cowards. So poor crows, they are being singled out here now and made into the cowards. So the next slide, I think, has a picture of a crow. Looks a little cowardly, maybe, but not quite as attractive as the peacock, huh? The poor little crow. But for some reason, crows are being called cowardly here. I don't really know much. I actually hear that crows and ravens are very intelligent birds, so I don't know that they're necessarily that cowardly. But we obviously, need to really practice well this path. Maybe we go back to the previous slide to where the verse is. This idea, presently, that means kind of here, given that we're in the particular situation that we're in, hopefully some people who have an interest in practicing the Dharma, we can begin to see that attachment's like a jungle of lethal poison. We can see that we are just potentially going to be drawn into more suffering if we continue to follow that mind. But we can see that it also can be overcome by the peacock-like heroes, that if we can utilize what the products of our attachment are, what's causing the attachment that's causing us to have particular experiences in our life, through our past grasping, through what's arising in terms of the suffering we experience, the day-to-day things, we can use all of that in the path. That we can actually transform what we're experiencing in the same way that the peacocks transform the aconite into something that will make them more beautiful. So there isn't really, again, I'll look at Geshe-la's commentary. This one he didn't really say a whole lot, but as I said, it's really kind of hard to get this idea of how bodhisattvas work with attachment per se, rather than the products of all the delusions. Our delusions are what are manifesting, or what are the forces behind what's manifesting in our experiences. All of our karma is driven by delusions. All of what we experience is driven by our karma. So in that way, we have the products of all these delusions all around us all the time. So do we use those experiences that we have in a more productive way, or do we get caught up in them? I was going to share this was from Geshe, Venerable Samlo Geshe Khalsang at Losang Drakpa Center in Malaysia. He was asked, to give an example of how a bodhisattva makes use of attachment as a cause for more realizations. And he says it's difficult to give an example offhand. However, referring to the example of the king who had 1,000 sons, if he had abandoned all defilements, he would not have 1,000 sons. So in the sutra path, the bodhisattvas still keep the defilements as tools to help others and also to accumulate merit for themselves. In the tantric path, it is explained that there are coarse mind and subtle mind. Subtle mind is used to understand emptiness. This method using attachment is used to stop the coarse mind and to activate the subtle mind while one is alive, and in that way, achieve tantric realizations. But he really didn't have, and none of the teachers really had that many examples of how does a bodhisattva on the sutra path use the actual affliction of attachment in that way. Because, again, the sutra path is much more about combating these afflictions, antidoting them, doing things that are contrary to them. In this presentation with the Mahayana, it's saying, okay, these are places like the jungle of cyclic existence where attachment arises, where anger arises, where all the delusions arise. We're going to use our experiences in this jungle of cyclic existence to awaken our bodhicitta, to become more and more in line with that thinking. So one thing that's emphasized by the teachers at this point, and Geshe Jampa Gyatso in particular, is the need to make sure we have a good foundation in the other aspects of the Lam Rim. I talked about them earlier today, the 3 levels of capacity. So know that we're at this level of great scope, where we're looking at somebody who has a very courageous mind, who wants to engage in practices that will lead to enlightenment. Whereas the small and the middle scope are not at that level of motivation for the person who practices them alone. As, again, people training in the mind of enlightenment, we want to do all of our practices with bodhicitta. But we do see that we have to have a strength of practice in the small and the middle scope to do the great scope well. And I'm just emphasizing that because, again, all these teachers, their commentaries, they seem to emphasize this in this particular verse as well, to see that we have this opportunity in this life, if we know the Dharma well, are well versed in the Lam Rim, to use our experiences in this way. So let's go to the verse 5 then. How can the selfish overcome this poison if they are also similarly involved in the other afflictions? These afflictions will cost the crow-like their life. So this is once more Dharma-Rakshita continuing with this example of the crows, saying that if they don't have this strength of mind, if they don't have bodhicitta, don't have an understanding of how to use their experiences in that way, they're going to simply get caught up in the afflictions in the same way they always have. There's not going to be any real change in their minds. They will just cultivate similar causes of suffering, and in that way only continue to be in cyclic existence, be in samsara, and not ever transcend that even. So, again, I don't know that there's a lot more to say on this either. If we had Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary in front of you, then I'd go through what he says there, but he really just simply explains a little bit more of it, but there's not that many uncommon elements here. These are relatively straightforward. Just so you know, in terms of, as I go through, I'll try to highlight the ones that I included in my little quizzes, and certainly verse 1 and 2 that we spent a little time on, that is one that I'd emphasize, as well as the previous one, verse 4. But this is just introducing this idea through this analogy of the crows, the peacocks, the difference between these two types of beings. So, any questions up to this point? Okay, let's go on then to verse 6, which we've divided into two parts. The first 3 lines, let's recite that together. Because of this, the peacock-like brave-minded ones combine the afflictions, which are like a jungle of poison, into an elixir, and enter the jungle of cyclic existence. Of course, there is that, more traditional concept of the bodhisattva kind of willingly taking rebirth again and again. Even at the very end of Master Shantideva's text, right, there's that idea of, for as long as space exists, as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. This sort of willingness to put off one's own enlightenment, to continue to be in samsara, to address the suffering of the world. But as we all know, the more that you have that strong mind that wishes to be the last one through the doors of enlightenment, the quicker you become enlightened. It's a bit of a paradox. That's when we study bodhicitta, remember the 3 different kind of levels of courage that we can have. We can be the ruler-like courage, where you're like the ruler of a kingdom, and then you know that you have to be in a position of superiority in order to help other people who are your subjects. So that's the least amount of courage, because you get there first and then bring everyone else along. The second level of courage is like the boat captain who, takes everybody on the boat with them. So that's another way that you can have a courage to say, you're all going to get enlightened with me. I'm not going to, go ahead of you. But then the last one is like the shepherd or shepherdess who stays behind to make sure the sheep are all safe before becoming, kind of retiring for the evening. So in the same way, the bodhisattva, in that case, she or he would want to wait until all sentient beings are enlightened before becoming enlightened themselves. And of course, that isn't possible to do that, because you actually have to become a Buddha to help others to become enlightened. So anyway, this is this idea that we certainly, need that level of willingness to engage in whatever samsara presents for as long as it takes. There's all these verses that we hear of, of how we need that kind of level of fortitude that could go to the hell realms for eons for the sake of even a single sentient being. But we need to be that brave, that willing to continue to be in samsara however long it takes to be able to transform others into, help them to achieve enlightenment and so on. So this is, again, just along the same lines of the same introductory topic. Let's go to the next slide. This is just the next line of this verse, the final line. While willingly accepting them, they should destroy the poison. So this is the idea. We have to have that willingness to go into these, whatever samsara has to offer, whatever states of suffering we have to experience. But it's not like we just go there and don't do anything with it. We go there with the idea that we will endure that suffering and transform it into a cause to annihilate that suffering, to annihilate the causes of our suffering, all the delusions and so on. So this is, again, the idea that we don't do the same pattern that the crow-like cowards do, which is buying into the delusions and continuing to create more causes of suffering, but rather we accept that suffering and we do what we can to overcome our self-cherishing, self-grasping, these twin demons, as well as all the other ways that the delusions are manifesting. So let me look at what Geshe-la says here and see if there's anything I can add to that. I had one little passage here, let me see. Again, I've highlighted some passages that I thought might be useful. I'm in the wrong text. That's why I was like, this doesn't look right. That's Tibetan children's text. So we only have a few more verses left in this beginning section that spell out this idea. Let me get to my notebook here and... Okay. Let me just let it at that, because I don't know that this needs to be read. Let's go to the next verse then. Presently, for those circling without freedom, self-grasping is Mara's messenger, while parting from the happinesses of selfishness and hedonism, let's continue with the next. We should willingly accept hardships for the welfare of others. Now go back to the previous one, and we'll just talk about this a little bit. So this idea of, for those circling without freedom, for those of us who are still caught up in the bonds of samsara, those who are still under the control of self-grasping and so on. Self-grasping is Mara's messenger. Now, Mara, we know this term Mara. Mara is, it's said that when the Buddha was trying to, as Prince Siddhartha sitting under the Bodhi tree in the final stages before achieving enlightenment, that Mara, who is this malevolent force in the world, kind of showed up in various guises to try to disturb the Buddha's meditation and cause the delusions to arise. But there are some forms of Mara that they say might be physical beings that are, kind of mischief makers. But of course, the main Maras are the Maras in our own minds, our own delusions that are kind of running the show. So self-grasping and self-cherishing, of course, could both be considered Maras. But in this particular commentary, it's saying that self-grasping is Mara's messenger, meaning kind of it precedes, comes first before Mara. It's like the messenger that heralds the arising of the Mara. And so, as I mentioned earlier, these two, self-grasping and self-cherishing, are going to switch roles periodically. And in some commentaries, suddenly they'll appear like, well, one's the main one, and the other one's the subject, one's the master, one's the subject, one's the messenger, one's the main one. And it keeps flipping around. And that's because they work in tandem. They said when they're both present in the mind, they become really destructive, because then we are being guided by our ignorance, which is happening anytime we have the delusions. But moreover, we're clinging tightly to this idea of our own needs being met first through that self-cherishing. So in this example, self-grasping is kind of the herald of self-cherishing, what's coming before, that's announcing the arisal of our self-cherishing. Now, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, my teacher, when he wrote his commentary, he says self-cherishing itself is a Mara, its messenger is self-grasping. Oh, that's right, that's the way I said it. But then when I went to another commentary, which was in Tupten Chodron's as well as even in this one, they said the opposite, that it was actually worded the opposite, that what self-grasping is the actual Mara. Again, if we look at it from the point of view of which is the deeper error, which is the one that is the beginning point for our whole state of existence, it's self-grasping. But when we look at it from the point of view of which one is more operative in our lives, then self-cherishing is taking a pretty primary role, because this is how we live our lives with that mind intent on our own welfare. So he says the main thing that makes all sentient beings engage in cyclic existence without working towards Buddhahood is self-cherishing. So in this way, this is what we are trying to identify and be free of. So it says there, while parting from the happiness of selfishness and hedonism, the next line, you should willingly accept hardships for the welfare of others. So once more, we see that there's this admonition by Dharma-Rakshita that this is how these brave bodhisattvas practice, is that they don't succumb, to the normal patterns of behavior, but rather willingly accept anything that we have to endure, any hardship, so that we can benefit others. Okay. Let's go on then to the last verse in this initial section that's just kind of setting the stage for everything else that we're going to see, kind of how we work with this idea going forward. The sufferings of all beings who are similar in kind, in being driven by actions and habituated to the afflictions, should be heaped upon us hedonists. So this already starts to sound a bit like Tonglen. And we could say that this is introducing this idea that we have this willingness to endure suffering, to even take upon ourselves that suffering, to heap it upon us, all the afflictions, all the suffering that other beings have. So we're going to see the formal verse that introduces Tonglen in the next one. But this is really one of the most powerful ways of combating our self-cherishing mind, is to have that willingness to endure what we're enduring or what others are enduring in the face of a mind that traditionally and quite instinctively doesn't want us to suffer. That wants that to be out of our lives. Rather, we welcome in that suffering. We welcome those hardships. We try to embrace them as part of our path of learning. So, Geshe, I'll read a little bit of his commentary on this one. This is Geshe Jampa Gyatso. He says, "We who wander without freedom in the abodes of cyclic existence and experience only suffering are driven by the bad actions we have accumulated under the power of self-cherishing and habitually rely on the afflictions by the force of having done this many times. Because of this, from now on, we should heap upon ourselves, we who desire our own happiness and comfort, all the sufferings without exception of all the beings who are similar in kind to us in being driven by actions and afflictions." So this is just that idea that this is the formula for how we want to be practicing with whatever we meet that we call suffering, is that we say, bring it on. This is wonderful. I get this opportunity to experience this. And it helps us to open our heart to the suffering of others. So again, this initial section is just, as I said, sort of setting the stage, introducing this analogy, talking about how courageous it is to practice in this way, but we haven't yet gotten to the actual instruction of what particular things are arising, how we can reframe them, how we can look at them, how we can actually make them into our path. So that advice kind of begins with this next verse, verse 9, which again is the next outline, which is practicing removing others' suffering and giving them happiness. So this is, as I said, where we introduce the practice of Tonglen. Tonglen is part of that technique for generating bodhicitta that I mentioned this morning. That's called equalizing and exchanging self and others. So I'll talk about it a bit once we go through the verse. So let's read verse 9, the first two lines. This is about giving. "Supposing we were to dwell entangled in selfishness at that time, to counteract it, we should give our happiness and pleasure to migrating beings." So the words Tonglen in Tibetan, Tong does mean give and Len means take. We usually call it taking and giving practice because this is how we generally engage in it. First is taking away suffering and then giving happiness. But even in this verse, we see that the giving side of it is being presented first. This is how we combat that tendency that we have to grasp at our own pleasure. To think that anything we have in our lives is for us alone to experience, and we don't think about others who could benefit from that pleasure or about sharing it with other beings so they can have happiness. So we try to break that pattern by engaging in this practice of giving. So rather than having a selfish attitude that gets consumed with that experience and only creates more attachment, instead we try to counteract the attachment and give away that happiness, give away that experience. So this is, again, speaking to any experience of pleasure that we have, we can have that mindset that is guided by the bodhisattva motivation, bodhicitta, to want to give others our happiness, want to let them experience it. So I'll talk a bit more about the practice of Tonglen in a moment. Let's go to the other two lines where it's said to be the taking side of it, but it's already gearing us up for what's going to happen in the next verse and beyond. So let's read this. "Likewise, when those around us mistreat us, we should be filled with contentment, thinking this is retribution for having distracted them." So whenever we experience any kind of hardship, any misery, we should say, oh, this is due to my own past karma. This is due to my own having done things to harm other beings. So this is like the perfect opportunity for me to welcome in that being mistreated, to welcome in that suffering, to even engage in the practice of taking away the suffering of others, thinking that by our having to experience that, others can be free from that. By our being harmed, then may they not be harmed. We actually feel good when difficult things are happening in our lives. So, Geshe Japa Gyatso does give some advice on how to practice Tonglen. Most of you in the room are familiar with how it is practiced. I'll say a few words about it, but I don't know that I need to give extensive instruction. As I said, it can be done like whenever we're encountering anything, what we might call Tonglen on the spot. So if something pleasant comes into our lives, we can immediately have the thought of just giving it away, not getting attached to it, thinking of others, may they experience that. Or when something unpleasant comes into our lives, that we can immediately think, oh, I'll willingly take this on, with the thought that others won't have to experience that. So in the moment, it can be practiced very powerfully that way, but it also can be done as a meditation. And when we get into these next verses, there's the specific advice that Geshe-la always gives in his commentary. Well, not always for every single verse, but gives it frequently enough that he wants us to practice Tonglen when these things are happening. Not just think about the karmic effects that we're experiencing, but to think kind of beyond this, that not just that this is retribution for having harmed others, it's the idea, and I'm going to willingly take that on, so that others don't have to experience suffering. Even take on more than what I've been, that's on my plate. I'll take on all beings suffering so that they can be free from that. So the practice of Tonglen, when it's done as a formal meditation, you could certainly use these verses, especially the ones that we're coming into now, that we'll start with this verse 10, that go through verse 48, as a way of meditating on various results that you might be having in your life, or that you've had in your life, and kind of see that this is a way of understanding those particular forms of suffering, and on the basis of that, we can engage in the practice of Tonglen, thinking that all beings who are suffering in a similar way, we want to absorb that suffering into ourselves, willingly take it upon ourselves, and then give them our happiness. So the traditional way it's taught in the Gelugpa teachings is that we've got this mind of self-cherishing that is, we visualize at our heart in some form. This is a little different than what you see, like many of you know Pema Chodron's teachings, have read her books, a wonderful book. She's an amazing teacher, and she teaches Tonglen left and right. I mean, she's always teaching Tonglen, it seems. But she never talks about this idea of having self-cherishing at our heart. But I think this is a really valuable way to work with this idea of what we're talking about in this text, which is using the force of all that suffering to combat that mind. To think that we have that mind, it's here, a part of us, but it's something we don't desire to keep. We want to get rid of it. We want to be free of it. So we visualize it in some form, and usually they say a form of being like a very thick rock, hard rock, something that is massive and feels kind of uncomfortable in the center of our chest. And we breathe in suffering, whether it be our own suffering we're experiencing, we willingly take it in, the suffering of other beings, all the suffering there is. We try to breathe that in, bring it down to our heart center, and let it annihilate that mind of self-cherishing. And this is, again, I think, a very powerful kind of metaphor for what we're trying to do in annihilating that mind by using the visualization in that way. Now, when we bring it in, they often encourage you to bring that suffering in the form of a thick black smoke or something that's kind of hot and uncomfortable. One time there was like a little bit of an electrical fire in my kitchen, and I was right close to it, and I was like, oh, this is like what Tonglen should feel like. You breathe in that kind of ucky, really horrible smoke, but I don't know. So it should feel uncomfortable. I mean, because this whole process of taking that you normally start with is really about opening up to experiencing suffering. And that isn't a comfortable place to be. Most of us, again, are, thank you very much, I'll pass on that. I'd rather not experience that. But we all have difficulties and suffering in our lives to some degree. What's it like to open to that, to say, I'll willingly experience that, and even experience other suffering? So the idea of placing it on this mind of self-cherishing is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to annihilate that mind that is the deepest resistance to that taking. That keeps us from being willing, keeps us from being kind of fully engaged at that level. Then, some teachers say, well, you breathe it all in and it all comes to your heart center and it explodes and it's gone. well, like you could do it that quickly. I like to do it in a more gradual way, but that's just my personality, I guess. I don't know. So I like bring in a bit of the smoke and bring it down, and it eats away at a bit of the self-cherishing, and then I breathe in a bit more of the smoke, and do it in a much more easy way, so that eventually you get to a place where you're breathing in the last bit of suffering, and then the last bit of your self-cherishing mind disappears. So then you've done half the job, because you've removed the suffering by using your own suffering or whatever's going on as the means to do that. And you've removed your self-cherishing. Again, remove the suffering of others, annihilated your self-cherishing. But they still aren't happy, and you no doubt still have some grasping to your own pleasure, to your own happiness. So then you visualize sending that light, that all that you have that brings you happiness out to others. That was like in the previous verses where it says, to counteract all of our selfishness, we should give our happiness and comfort to migrating beings. So here what I have people do, and again, you can use any technique. You can be creative and make up your own technique. Tonglen's very creative in that way. But I visualize like a wish-fulfilling jewel at my heart that gets filled with light. And that light is everything I have that brings me happiness. All of my resources, all of my merit, friends, my own body, everything kind of absorbing into that wish-fulfilling jewel in the form of light, and then I begin to send it out to others, thinking about other beings who need the temporal happiness, the happiness in the moment that will help them to be somewhat more at peace, but then the greater causes of happiness, sending them out teachers and dharma and everything that they need to develop their minds. And then do this in a very gradual way, again, sending more and more light out each time, so that eventually I send out the last bit of light and it becomes the final cause for taking them to the state of enlightenment. So again, you can do it in a variety of ways, but this is just one technique to do the whole process of taking and giving in a more formal meditation. Yeah, Steve?
I was wondering, do you find it most effective you take in all the suffering first before you give out the giving? Because my experience has been alternating, like you take on some suffering and then you do some giving.
Yeah, some people do it that way with alternating, but I like to do it and do all the taking first and kind of annihilate the self-cherishing and focus on that. It feels to me, and this is just again my own experience, like it's trying to do too much by alternating. I breathe it in and then whoa, go. I mean, there's an alchemical thing that's kind of interesting there, because it's sort of like transmuting all of that negative stuff you bring in and making it into something positive you send out, but I don't know. As I said, you can be really creative with this, so if it works for you to do it that way, and not everybody teaches right from the beginning to use the breath, but I think the breath is a very powerful tool to use, to breathe in light or darkness and to breathe out light, the teaching assistant in the master's program, Jampa Gendon, he had very violent ways of visualizing during this. One visualization was where there was a lump of meat at his heart center that represented the self-cherishing mind. And then he invited in, breathing in the suffering in the form of like carnivorous beasts that would come at his heart center and devour the meat. Just a little too violent for me. But, do what works for you. Yes, Amelia.
If situations of being really disturbed by noise,
Mm-hmm.
and then, so a typical one for me, now I moved somewhere where the downstairs neighbors, they are elderly and so on, and they love to watch television very loud. Good, great. But, I'm guessing that lovely music, I'm being sarcastic here, and it's really disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
And although there is the awareness, and now I'm listening to you, and so like, what could be a Tonglen practice? It's not that I feel anything against them. Mm-hmm. Well, they are going about their lives, and the body decays, so they want it louder. Mm-hmm. But then, is that towards myself? Is that to really be listening to the television and music? It's like, I'm taking it, and yes. That's disturbing, but come on, because of course it's disturbing because there is a selfish nature. I want to be quiet, in quiet mode. But
Well,
Is that
I guess again, what we're going to go into in these verses, and maybe we can look at this again after we've gone through some of the verses, is the idea that we are the creators of these experiences. So if you've got noisy neighbors, guess what? That's your karmic creation. And it's not to say again that they aren't doing what they're doing. They're doing what they're doing, and maybe they have an intention to disturb you. Maybe they're just living their lives and don't even think about others, whatever the case is. But their actions are one thing. Our experience of that is our stuff. So if it's our karma, we've created it, then there's something we need to learn from that. So the Tonglen can be done at a number of levels. The Tonglen of understanding that we ourselves have created patterns of suffering for ourselves like this, and work at that level. We can expand to the fact that many beings create similar karma to where they experience lots of noise, distraction, things that interrupt their peace of mind. We can think about the people who intentionally create that type of thing and breathe in all of that. You can work at whatever level works for you, but the other side of it that I think is important to say, because as I was mentioning earlier, being compassionate doesn't mean that you become a doormat. If you can change a situation in a way that is free of delusion, not getting angry at them and banging on their walls and making them disturbed. If you can find a way to change it, then there's nothing wrong with changing it. But while you're experiencing it, then utilize it. I don't want to make it sound like we should just sit there and, some things are relatively minor when it comes to it. I'm not saying that something like that can become a real difficult thing if it's going on every night, and we're not resting every night or whatever the case might be. But nonetheless, we use some wisdom as well. We say, well, is there a way that I can talk to my neighbors very peacefully, very, not confronting them or anything, just saying, then change it. But if it's something you feel courageous enough to work with every night, and you can sit there and do your Tonglen and be happy that they're making all the noise that they're making because you're using it in your practice, well, that's great. I mean, we practice at whatever level we're at. So I don't know if your question wasn't quite around that, but I think there are people who can, and we can see it, really great practitioners who will be willing to use whatever they meet. They say that, for example, a bodhisattva on the third level, third ground, they've developed their realization of emptiness to the point where they will be patient in the face of anything. For example, if you had somebody who was, they use the example, it's a very strange example, of somebody who would be like cutting through your arm very slowly with maybe with a dull blade or something. Just something that you would have to endure, that you would just be willing to totally endure it and only create more and more compassion for that person. Well, that's pretty highly advanced. I mean, I'm sorry, most of us aren't there. So you don't practice at that level right now because you can't. So you say, thank you, I know what level I can practice to. I can practice Tonglen with them till 11 o'clock at night or 12 o'clock at night, and then I have to do something, then I have to go down and knock on their door and say, just wondering, if you could maybe keep it down a little bit, and da-da-da-da, whatever the case might be. But I again think that we get confused sometimes and think that we have to practice at these outrageous levels right from the beginning, and we can't. So then we at least try to confront things in ways that don't cause more disturbance, But that's hard too sometimes. That's why I travel with earplugs. That's another wonderful thing. Like Master Shantideva says, you could coat the entire world with leather so it would all be smooth and nice, or you can just put leather on the bottom of your own feet, and that way you don't step on any sharp objects that hurt you. So it's the same type of thing. If there's a way to protect ourselves from being inflamed by the various things around us, there's no problem with doing that. These teachings are to help us that when that's happening, at least to have some practice about, oh, well, where's that coming from? What can I do about that? Can I do something different right now that will keep me from creating the same causes to experience it again and help me to have compassion for others? So, anyway, we'll get into this when we start this next section. Are we ready to move forward? Okay, so let's introduce this next section. We have kind of a general outline. If we continue on the next slide, it'll show what we're going to be looking at for these 4 lines of each of these verses. This is going to be where, like I said, it'll get a bit repetitive, and I don't know that we'll need to spend, tons of time on all of these, but nonetheless, each one has a very valuable little lesson within it. And this is the format through verse 45. The last 3 verses, 46, 47, and 48 of this section, are kind of very general in terms of the results. But we're going to look at, first in line A, Dharma Rakshita is going to say, okay, you got this going on in your life. I mean, and today it would be, maybe you've got, noisy neighbors with playing TVs at, midnight, 1 in the morning. Well, guess what? It's your karma. Not to, like I said, not to say the other person isn't doing anything. We acknowledge that they are doing sometimes. Sometimes they even do something quite intentional to harm us. We might have people who are kind of out to get us. But this is about why you are experiencing that. And then line C says, well, guess what? That's because you did this in the past. It's like helping us to identify what was the real specific thing that we engaged in that caused us to have this experience. And then line 4 is, okay, do something different. Here's a suggestion of what would be the remedy, what would be something you would do differently. So go to the next verse. So line A, again, is an unfortunate circumstance that we experience. Our usual response is affliction, because we're normally like the crow-like cowards. We're like just reacting in these habitual ways. And we'll normally get angry, annoyed, frustrated, depressed, whatever the case might be. And this is like the poison that we want to transmute, is to kind of take in that experience, see that it's the potential for a delusion to arise, but we're going to use it in an exact opposite way. We're going to use it in a way so that we actually create something beneficial out of that. So line B, the next slide, I called this, it's your karma, to understand that this is not a random event, but caused by your actions. Increases our confidence in karma and reduces the blame, which of course is one of our patterns that we have too, right? We blame the whole world for creating our misery. And so this is you taking responsibility for transmuting, saying, okay, this is my stuff, it's my karma, this is my karmic creation. My neighbors are my karmic creation. There are no accidents when it comes down to it in Buddhism, because everything is a product of our karma. If it's in your life, you created the cause for it at one point or another. You might think, oh, in this life I've been like a mouse in my apartment. I've never made a noise for anybody in the world. I've never annoyed them in any way. Well, we don't just have this life. Again, we have many, many lifetimes when we've engaged in planting all of these seeds. So, but this is the second line, is just to really say, okay, this is your plate of food that you prepared for yourself at some point in the past, and now it's kind of there for you to eat it. So let's go on to line C. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about the general characteristics I normally do. Let me talk about these briefly. I think most of you in the room are familiar from your Lam Rim studies. But when we talk about karma, we are talking about essentially the cause. We usually sometimes refer to it as the law of cause and effect, but it really means the cause. It really means the actions that we engaged in through our minds primarily, but also frequently through our speech and through our physical actions, our bodies. So there's 4 characteristics that guide how karma works in the world according to Buddhism. The very first one, karma is definite. This doesn't mean definite to ripen. It means definite in terms of the product, the result of that cause, is going to be in line with that. So if we have something we call suffering in our lives, difficulty, challenges, that came from something that was negative that we thought, said, or did. Something that was in an unwholesome vein that ripened now into this suffering experience. If we have a result in our life that is pleasurable, that is, getting the nice piece of cake and getting the wonderful friend and all the things that we enjoy in our lives, well, that is a product that is in direct alignment with the cause, which would be something positive we've done. So let's use the idea of resources. If we have stolen from others, cheated others, done things that have taken resources out of the pocket of others, that's a cause for the suffering of us to lose resources, to have our wealth stolen from us or in some way mismanaged or whatever. If we have been generous and kind to others with our resources, been very easy to give others what they need and so on, then that ripens into resources for us in the future that come to us without much effort and so on. So this is how it's always definite. We never get resources from stealing from others. In the moment you might have those resources because you stole from others, but that is not the result of that act of stealing. The result of that act of stealing hasn't come yet, and it will be to lose your resources in the future. Whereas what you are experiencing in gaining resources is a product of your past generosity. It's always definite. There's no mixing of things. I did a positive thing and got a negative result. I did a negative thing and got a positive result. The second one, karma increases. This is harder for us to understand, but in the physical world, we do see that causes can create much greater results than what they start as. An apple seed, for example, is quite small, right? But if you put that apple seed in the ground and, of course, accompany it with a number of other factors, you need the water and the sunlight and the nutrients in the soil and all the other tending to it, people that are involved, whatever, you eventually get bushels and bushels of apples from a fully, mature apple tree. So it starts off quite small, and it produces things that are quite large in nature. Well, karma expanding in this way is said to be exponential and so far beyond just what we see in nature. And this is for all those positive things that we do, even the slightest ones can have amazing results. All of the negative things we do that are not so wholesome can have unbelievable suffering that they produce. The third one, results cannot be experienced without their causes. This is just a simple understanding that without having done the particular cause, the result will never appear. Of course, the corollary to this is that if we have that particular result, then we had to have created the causes. Because you can't have the result without the cause. So if the result's there, the cause was there. If the result's not there, well, guess what? The cause wasn't there. You didn't create it. And then finally, the fourth one, once causes are created, results will be experienced eventually. And I put in parentheses here, unless interrupted. And this is the important understanding, because otherwise, everything we've created, we are bound to experience, and there's no way to ever change it. Rather, what it is everything that we created that is negative, there is a way to address it. And this is through the power of purification. And those things that we created that are positive, unfortunately, they too can be interrupted. They can be damaged by minds of of anger, really strong anger, wrong views, things like this that are very heavy minds. So I think my next slide is the results of karma. I'm just going to throw this out too. This is another Lamrim topic. The Buddha says that there are 4 results of our karma. Those 4 kind of fill out our entire experience. The first one is our fruitional or ripened results, which means the very existence that you get is determined by your karma. So we all created something very positive because karma is definite. We created a positive karma in the past that at the end of our previous life ripened into a human existence. Hooray, that's a wonderful thing. This is why, again, karma is taught at the very lowest level of the stages of the path, because we have to know how to create the results for a good rebirth. And that's to avoid negative actions, because negative actions will ripen into unfortunate states. Then we have 2 results that are similar to the cause, meaning that there's some idea about them that will be replicated in what we experience. So here we did an action that causes us to have an experience that is very similar. This is in the West, when we think of karma, this is mostly what we think of, right? If you see somebody kind of, they just cut somebody off with their car and then somebody runs into them or something, you say, oh, that's their karma, because they just did something rude to one driver, now a driver's done something rude to them. This is what we mean by this in terms of experience, is that you have something that happens to you that is similar to what you did in the past. This is actually the result that we're going to be mostly looking at in this section. Is the idea that, okay, this is what's happening in your life, you're ill or you're dealing with this particular situation. What did you do that was something similar in the past that kind of got you into that predicament? And it's not always identical, but it's something that has the same sort of charge to it that ripens into that. The other way that results ripen in terms of something that is similar to the cause is in terms of our behavior. And this is one of the most pernicious things about karma, is that every time we follow a particular pattern, we have the ability to engage in that again, which is good for the good stuff. That's why we were able to develop good habits in our minds. But for the negative stuff, we have a tendency then to lie and cheat and have anger and all these other delusions. So in terms of our behavior, we have a result that is a direct product of what we've done in the past. This is why, to some degree, we can say we're under the control of our karma, because karma is dictating a lot of our mental states by virtue of what we've done in the past. But it's not fixed in stone. Karma is extremely dynamic. The final result is even our environment, the world we live in, is a product of our karma. You know, what the world's going through now in terms of climate change, we can identify through scientific means all the various factors that are influencing what we're experiencing now and will be in the future. And we can say those are causes from a scientific point of view. But there's a karmic cause behind this too. You know, how this is a manifestation of the delusion in this world and what we have done in following that delusion that has created these patterns that are ripening into that. But even just in any specific environment, in London or other parts of England or the Southwest where I live, you know, different manifestations of the environment that they say are a product of particular karma. Yeah. And I remember, I find northern New Mexico really quite pretty, and some of you may have been there before, and it's really quite amazing in my mind. Venerable Rabina hated it. She thought it was just like the worst environment in the world. You know, she said, "Oh, who wants to live in that dry, arid place?" You know, so it's really, you know, again, karmic appearances, and some things will appear very delightful for some people, and other people like have a totally different experience. And that's, again, karmically conditioned, but that environment and the experience of that environment is karmically caused. So karma is involved in everything. The life we get, how that life gets filled out, and what we call the projecting karma, the things that, the completing karma, the things that make our lives have certain experiences. Why do some people, you know, lose a parent very early in their life, or have brothers and sisters that are really difficult, or whatever? This is all karmically conditioned. So this is just to give a scope of the different results. And as I said, we're mostly going to be looking at 2A in terms of our experience. We have particular experiences that we have. Well, where do those come from? You know, if those results are in line with the cause, well, then we should be able to identify the cause and stop doing it. Okay, next slide. On to line C. Line C gets at the specific cause. It answers the question, why me? You know, sure, it's my responsibility, it's my karma, I got that in line B, but why me? What did I do? You know. So it makes us aware of past actions, and this is like seeing the cause of the poison to know more clearly how to transmute. So if we see what is behind that poison, what is behind this suffering experience, then we know exactly what we can learn from that. Pema Chodron uses this idea, I'm kind of paraphrasing what she says, that karma is life giving you the lessons you need to learn. And this is a powerful way of looking at it. This is what this section of the text is trying to do for us, is to say, if these things are manifesting in our lives, well, certainly don't make them the cause of more delusion, because that's how you got in trouble in the first place. But what is there that you can learn from that? You know, if we have a particular thing happening in our life, we can say, oh, wow, this is really valuable. This is like a mirror being held up to me and saying, you created the cause for this, so what specifically can you learn? Or what can you discern from that you can say, okay, now I need to do something differently? And that leads us to D, a resolution to act in the opposite way in the future. And then, of course, as I mentioned, Geshe-la says also we would include meditating on taking and giving. It's not mentioned overtly in the text in every line, but this should be our process, is once we've kind of made a determination, I'm accepting that suffering is something I've created, I'm determining I'm going to act in a different way. Now let me take on that suffering willingly, transmute it, transform all I have to the causes of happiness for others. This is like the actual means to transmute the poison, to say, I'm going to use this not just to understand karma. I mean, I think if we looked at this text and we studied it as a Hinayana text, this whole section would be really useful in and of itself to say, I need to take karmic responsibility for how I'm creating suffering in my own life. And therefore, I need to overcome the delusions using the tools that are taught in the Hinayana tradition, which are perfectly fine in doing that work. Achieving foe destroyer, getting rid of that component of our experience, no longer experiencing suffering. But it's a Mahayana teaching. It's looking at it and saying, I'm not just going to understand the karma of what I need to what I did in the past, how I need to change that, what I would do differently. I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to become aware of the suffering of others, to become aware of how others need happiness. Because none of us are alone in our suffering. We might think our particular situation, given all the dynamics, all the specifics of what happened when you were 6, and then what happened when you were 21, what happened when all the different points in your life that have coalesced into your existence, you seem quite unique. But the particular things that you're going through are not that unique. They're just, other people have them, they're just a different person given different circumstances, but the same states of mind. We all deal with these. We all deal with various experiences that are quite similar. So this is the idea behind this structure. Any questions up to this point before I talk a little about the 4 opponent powers? Yeah, Amelia.
When you are aware that this is because of karma, but this so in relation to something you've done in the past. So let's say I was a noisy teenager, giving noise to everyone. But does that also mean I have a karma with those individuals?
Yeah.
It could be other people, or does that specifically mean, okay, we are back here, now it's kind of payback time, fine?
I mean, I think based on the teachings I've had, I have to think that it has to be with those particular people, that there's some karma. Yeah. Venerable Rabina and I debated this in the car once. We were driving to the prison where I teach, or she was going there to visit the prisoners that I teach, and she said that in her mind it makes absolute sense that it has to be quite personal. That it's not a general karma, because again, why are you on the receiving end of that from those particular people? It's all a whole package. It's not like, So, of course, what it means, I guess there are experiences we have where we experience noise or other things that aren't associated with beings, right? There are annoyances in our life that don't have any sentient being behind them. We can be living in a place where there's a lot of natural noise, what have you, that can be disturbing for us. Well, then, maybe those cases we created noise, but the person isn't there to manifest that, be a cause of that. There are inanimate causes of it, but I think a lot of what we experience, if it's animate, if a being is doing that to us, there's some karmic connection to that being. Venerable Rabina once, when she was teaching about generosity, she said, if you're walking down the street and a homeless person asks you for money, don't think that's someone else's homeless person. That's your homeless person. Like they're asking you for money, so there's some karmic connection there. There's something that makes that different. We shouldn't just say, oh, well, someone else will take care of them, let them get money from those people that are, behind me. If somebody asks you, then that's your homeless person. That's your... So I think when we hear these teachings, I think we can't feel, but there is some personal connection there that... Now, what are the ramifications of that? It means that maybe, again, we have to go beyond not just stopping doing that in the future, but maybe we even have to make some reparation to that person. Find a way to resolve that. I don't know. It gets you thinking in different ways, perhaps. Some of you have heard the golf ball story, haven't you? The golf ball story about this George Farley, I think, was the student in Australia. He's one of Rinpoche's students. He went to a gathering at this one man's house, and the man was named Stuart, and Stuart was having difficulty with a next-door neighbor. The story goes that he had come driving down the street, and Stuart's car was on the road, and the guy sideswiped his car going into his driveway and just pulled into his garage and went into his house, didn't even come over and say anything. And Stuart saw all of this, and he he ended up going over, confronting the man. They had a huge argument. They went through the insurance company, and of course the guy's insurance had to pay for all the damage. So he gets his car back, and it's all repaired. And he comes out one day, and it's got a scratch down the entire side of it. And of course he didn't see the man do this, but he thinks, oh, this is my neighbor getting back at me. And so he decides not to confront him, because he doesn't know for sure that he did it. He'll go and just get it repaired. So he pays for it himself to have it all smoothed out. And he goes out there another day, and there's another scratch down the side. And this is where this man's at now. Stuart is dealing with the second scratch after the man ran into his car. And the man's extremely difficult to deal with. So he's asking for advice from the people at his gathering. Well, what do you think I should do now? And people were like saying, oh, I'd go over there and scratch his car and do all these things, the coward-like crow responses. So then George Farley says, well, I don't know what I would do, but I can think of what maybe Rinpoche would do, what Lama Zopa would do. And Stuart says, he's not Buddhist, but he says, well, what advice would he give? He said you would think of what is the best thing that I could possibly buy for this man, like a gift that would make him so happy. And you go out and you get it and you wrap it up very nicely and you go over and you offer it to him and you apologize and you just try to make peace with him that way. And all the people at the party are like, are you crazy? You don't do that. And so Stuart thought about it and he said, well, I'll give this a try. This sounds better than like continuing to have this animosity with the next door neighbor. So he knew that this guy was an avid golfer and really liked, special things. He got these very expensive golf balls. I don't golf, so I don't even know what expensive golf balls would look like. But he wrapped them up really nicely and he took them over there and he kind of nervously knocks on the door and the man comes to the door and is like shocked to see Stuart there. And Stuart hands him this wrapped gift and says, I just want to apologize for anything that I've ever done, that has caused you any harm, has been any difficulty for you, and I just want to offer this to you. And the man couldn't say a word, and just kind of takes it and goes inside and closes the door, and Stuart leaves. And he knows at that point, he's already won, if it was but not that it's a competition, but he's already done the right thing. He feels really good about what he's done. And he goes back to home, and the story continues that this man, after he opened the gift, came over and said this was the best thing that anybody ever did for him. And he was just really, thankful for Stuart having done that, and he apologized from his side for anything he ever did. And apparently they became good neighbors. Wow.
Was somebody else scratching the car?
I think he was. But that's courageous to be able to say, okay, there's a personal karma there. There's something that this person is involved with me that needs to be changed, and my habitual patterns of confronting it are not going to cause it to change. It's only going to one up, and then the next time he'll do something more, and then you'll do something more, and so he said, I'm going to take a completely different approach, one that's rooted in compassion, concern, not trying to have any kind of delusion present, just wanting to be genuinely concerned about the other man. So I like to share that example when I can, because this is just an ordinary guy who wasn't even Buddhist. I mean, he listened to this advice from some guy at his party, that Lama Zopa might do this, and he decided to do it. I found it quite inspiring. Yeah, Adam.
So it seems that aside from the special case where we get to study these kind of texts and it outlines, your karma that you're experiencing, the result of now, is probably caused by something you've done in the past, like having cheated, stolen, or this is kind of almost like a little diagnosis, like saying, okay,
Absolutely.
This is roughly what we think has happened. But in general, it seems really unfair that someone will have to experience the results of the karma, like going to some cold hell or a hot hell for I don't know how long, thousands of years, without even being told, okay, this was the specific thing you did that caused that.
Sure.
And like every day these bad things are happening, like these noisy neighbors.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't get connected in our minds, like the result with our action.
It's not like the experience comes with a little tag that says, this has been brought to you by your past life when you were, you know. No, this is why, I mean, fairness, you use the word fair, and fairness doesn't enter into the equation when we talk about karma. It's just a simple law of cause and effect. It's just like if you do a particular thing physically, you walk through poison ivy or poison oak or something, then you create the causes, if you have your skin exposed to it, to have the suffering of that toxin on your, creating blisters on your skin. It's just a simple law of cause and effect. Now, that's said to be one of the levels of ignorance that beings are dealing with, is that they don't know about karma, they don't understand it, and that's why beings are suffering to an even greater degree. So, just having an awareness of karma is already revolutionary for people, because it means they take responsibility for their own actions and the consequences of those actions. Because there's no one else involved. There's no divine being that's inflicting punishment on people, or there's no randomness to what's happening either. There's a process that is, I'm creating the causes and I'm experiencing the results. Because I can't see this connection, I always joke with people, like if you were getting ready to step on an ant and a huge shoe is coming down on your head, you'd get karma really quickly, because you're like, okay, I'll stop, But we don't see that, because it's sometimes many lifetimes between when we created the action and when we experience the result. So that's why just having knowledge of karma is revolutionary for people. And what to do? I mean, until beings have that knowledge, everybody works with a different assumption. With it's random, or God created it, or it's your fault, with the blame thing that we talked about earlier. Stuart could say, it's your fault that my car's damaged. He had nothing to do with it. Stuart had nothing to do with it. I mean, that would be a view of somebody who doesn't take any personal responsibility at all. And I'm not saying this guy in the golf ball story had that view of karma, or an understanding of karma. But if we have that awareness, then we take responsibility and we say, okay, it's my mess. I created it. I'll clean it up.
And so it seems that if we took away the suffering of other people, that would be one of the worst things we could do in many cases, because we'd be taking away their learning of things.
But this gets to be, if someone is that highly practiced that they know that they can use their suffering in that way, maybe that would be so. But most beings are not. And most beings, therefore, are objects of our compassion, and we don't want them to suffer. So we don't sit back and let them suffer and not try to stop it. Instead, we do whatever we can to stop suffering, simply because it's suffering. Because most beings aren't going to have the wherewithal to know that this suffering is ripening in their lives, and now I need to learn from it, now I need to do something different. If you've had those teachings and are working at that level, maybe what you're saying would make sense for me to not remove Adam's suffering, because Adam is adamant on using that suffering as part of his practice.
I mean, if the suffering is because of the things they're doing, their karma, and they're going to keep suffering, and we just take away the effects of it temporarily, they might just get stuck in that loop and.
But they're bound to get stuck in it if they suffer and they create the same afflicted states that got them in the suffering in the first place. You see what I'm saying?
So maybe if it's like taking away suffering by showing them the connection, like showing them the dharma.
Sure, if we can show people the dharma and do that skillfully and get through to them. But once more, going back to what I said earlier today, do we have the capability even now? I mean, even myself, as somebody who's been teaching dharma for 12 years or something, 13 years, do I have the ability, anybody on the street, to tell them something that's going to influence their karma? I doubt it. I just don't think that's that possible. So because they're suffering, because something's going on that's causing them pain and difficulty, better for me to respond out of compassion, to stop their suffering, make a karmic connection with them in some way, as somebody who cares about them, help them to have a little less suffering in their lives, even if it's only temporal. And there'll maybe be some seed planted that will ripen into me being able to help them in a different way in the future. We can't help in the moment very much, but we can help in the long term. That's why this is very much a long-term path. And always thinking in that way. That's why Rinpoche is always about creating the causes for as much as possible for beings to meet the Dharma in the future, for them to have good rebirths in the future, for all this stuff to ripen way out there. I can't do much for a mosquito that's, going around my room, at the moment in terms of its state of existence. But if I blow mantras on it, maybe it'll have some effect. That's what Rinpoche says. I believe it. So I agree with you in some of the points you're making, but they tend to be more focused on right now, and we have to think about what comes beyond, in other lifetimes even. So we better take a break. We're not going to get a break. It's already like 25 to 4. Let's try to reconvene right around 4, so everybody can stretch. And I'll talk a little bit about purification. I don't want to spend too much time on that either, because we really want to get into these verses and see what we can learn from the text. So, all right, short break.